Hello, and welcome to the very first lecture in American government. And I'm your Professor John Brown, and I'm here to work you through the magical world of American government. And I can feel the excitement boiling as we delve into this topic. And the first lecture today, I'm just going to lay out the groundwork, sort of the framework for which the rest of this class is going to build on. So, start talking today, we need to talk about our system we have. And as you know, we have our government system could best be described as a democratic republic. And I know there's a big semantic argument over whether we're a democracy or a republic, and that whole argument is really pedantic and really annoying. We are not a democracy in the sense that everyone gets to vote on everything. That's what a pure democracy is. And there is no country on the world today that is true of. Democracy is just a shorthand for describing a style of government that is based on the consent of the governed. Worth noting that only recently has democracy been considered a legitimate form of government. Philosophers like Aristotle and Plato thought of it as a degenerate form of government. So they thought of it as mob rule. So did some of the founders of this country. John Adams, for instance, and Alexander Hamilton were skeptical of the ability of average people to govern. It's worth noting, too, that democracy is no guarantee of good government, no guarantee that liberties are going to be protected. Democracies can fail sometimes. I mean, you look at the government today, what's it accomplishing today? Probably not that much, although maybe that's good. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But we do know, majorities, just because a majority rules or believes a certain thing doesn't necessarily mean that's the right thing. A majority of Americans at one point supported slavery, for example. So, in that sense, slavery was democratic, but obviously not a good system. And it's where we look at today, and the lesson is that just because a majority of people support something does not necessarily make it good or just. Now, I want to get to two concepts here I want to talk to you about. These are pretty simple, actually, but they become more complicated the more we think about them. If we were to talk about sort of the central conflict in this course, it's going to be the conflict between liberty and order. So what is liberty? Basically means that people can do what they want, maximize individual choice. Order is the value in which the rule of law is followed so that the actions of one person doesn't infringe on the well-being of others. So theoretically, in the United States, you should have the right to do whatever you want so long as you don't harm someone else. But that gets complicated when you try to define what harms someone else. For example, big news story in the news right now, vaccinations. Does the government have the power to compel you to get vaccinated or have your child vaccinated? Well, that's a matter of individual liberty, right? The problem is if you don't, you may be putting other people at risk. So then you run into order. So order and liberty on this issue conflict. Which one's going to win out? Or say, I don't know, you want to go protest at a funeral, which we'll talk about later on in the course. Well, again, individual right, you might have the right to do that, but that's damages public order. It also harms the people the mourners that are there. So there's a tension here is the point I'm getting at. And the perfect system is one that balances liberty and order perfectly. Too much liberty means people can do whatever they want, and that's going to fail because you're going to end up with anarchy. Some people are going to do bad things. Some people are going to harm other people. So we need order to protect people from that and to punish those who do harm others. Of course, on the other side of the equation, too much order can be repressive as well. You think of Saudi Arabia or China. The crime rates in those countries are much lower than the United States because they just kill you if you're suspected of a crime. So order can be repressive. Liberty can be anarchic. So we need both of these things, but we need them to balance each other out. We need to strike the perfect balance. And that is what the founders were trying to do when they wrote the Constitution, and that's what we are still trying to do today. It's a work in progress. And at the end of the day, there's not going to be a perfect balance. There may be a balance that you think is perfect, but there's never going to be a balance that everyone is going to agree is the perfect balance. Some quotes here about sort of skepticism of democracy. Edmund Burke, perfect democracy is the most shameless thing in the world. Democracy, while it lasts, is more bloody than either aristocracy or monarchy. There is never a democracy that does not commit suicide. John Adams, probably talking about the French Revolution. Or Winston Churchill may have summed it up best. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. So, in other words, democracy is very much a flawed form of government, but generally it beats the alternatives. Beats monarchy or theocracy or anarchy, which actually is not a form of government, but is an alternative to it. All right, some other key terms I want you to familiarize with. Social contract. This is the theory that the government only has the authority accorded to it by the consent of the governed. And by living in society, we are effectively signatories of this social contract. You might say, well, I don't remember ever signing this. Well, fair enough, and there are philosophers who will dispute that a social contract should exist because of that. But basically, the idea of a social contract goes sort of an Enlightenment era concept, and the idea is that we live in the United States. As such, we are bound to follow the laws and rules of the United States. That's our end of the contract. The other end of the contract, the government, is responsible for protecting our individual rights and liberties. If we break our end of the contract, the government can arrest us and put us in prison. If the government breaks their end of the contract, they don't protect our liberties, we can change the government through peaceful means, preferably through violence if necessary. So if you read the Constitution states that Congress derives its power from the consent of the governed. So this is an example of a social contract. A republic, which is the form of government we have, this is where power derives from citizens, but public officials make policy and govern according to existing law. So we never actually get to vote on federal law in the United States. We delegate that power to House members, to senators, and to the president, and they exercise that on our behalf. All right, so the Constitution is a restraint on government, but you don't want to restrain the government too much. You don't want to restrain it so much that it can't maintain order. So what we want is a government that's strong enough to maintain order, but not too strong that it will override liberty. And there's a famous quote from James Madison, which he wrote in one of the Federalist Papers, quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." So think about that for a minute. I mean, this is true. If people could always be counted on to do the right thing, there would be no need for government, because there would be no crime, there would be no wars. I mean, think about it. Crime is caused by either greed or desperation. If everybody did the right thing, greed goes away. So does desperation, because people in a position to help would voluntarily help those that need help. So, again, if humans' nature was completely good and humans always did the right thing, we wouldn't need government. But we know humans are not always good, and that's why we need government. Protect us from invasion, protect us from crime, to punish those that would do bad. So that, of course, we have a social contract, which I already talked about. There's also the concept of direct democracy versus representative democracy. Direct democracy is what would have existed in some of the Greek city-states 2,500 years ago. Give or take a few years. That's not really feasible, obviously, today in the United States, where we have a population of over 330 million. So what we have is representative democracy. We elect officials who govern on our behalf. And we're a republic, and power resides with the people, but it's divided into three branches. Separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. So it's divided in a bunch of different ways. So what are these terms? Let's talk about them. Separation of powers. So government power is divided among three branches. You probably know what they are. I hope you do. The executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. Legislative branch being Congress, executive branch being the president, judicial branch being the courts. All three of them have independent powers and responsibilities. Sometimes these powers overlap, but generally, power is divided in these three ways to prevent too much power from being in the hands of one person or one institution. To keep one of these branches from becoming abusive, we have what are called checks and balances. And this is where each branch of government shares powers with the other branches and holds some scrutiny and control over what they do. So Congress can investigate wrongdoing by the president. Courts can strike down acts of Congress or the president. So these would be examples of checks and balances. Federalism. We have a national government in Washington, D.C. We also have a state government in Nashville. This is because federalism. So we have federal level of government, then we have state governments, then we have local governments, city, county governments, etc. Federalism is because of federalism, which divides power up among the federal government and among the states. Once again, this was something the founders wanted to do because they feared too much centralized power. Talk about our political culture now. Factions, which would evolve into political parties. If you read many of the writings of the founders, then you will see that one of the things which concerned them was the potential for factions. A faction is basically a group of people with a common agenda. And the fear was that maybe these factions, group of people with a common agenda, would put their good ahead of the good of the country as a whole, or become more loyal to their faction than they are to the country itself. And while most of the founders were concerned about factions, most of them ended up joining them, and these factions would become what we know as political parties. So, you can decide for yourself whether you think the founders' warnings about faction/political parties were legitimate. In his farewell address, George Washington warned against entangling alliances abroad, and he warned against the dangers of factions or political parties. I think it's fair to say we've ignored him on both counts. All right, division. What divides us? Ideology. What is ideology or ideology? Well, this is basically a way of basic assumptions that you make about the world, how the world works, and they dictate your political views. So the two biggest ideologies in the United States are conservatism and liberalism. And there's others too. There's libertarianism, socialism, communism, fascism, but liberalism and conservatism are the big two. You probably know the Democrats are typically the liberal party. The Republicans are typically the conservative party. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, if you can't really boil these whole ideas down to one sentence. Political culture, this is a set of beliefs common to a group of people, which in the United States typically favors individualism. Think about it. Our national heroes are Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, John D. Rockefeller, Steve Jobs, people that pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Capitalism is our economic system. This is where business and key industries are privately owned. We have an egalitarian tradition, goes back to Andrew Jackson, or before that actually. Andrew Jackson is just sort of an obvious example of that. This is the belief that humans are basically equal. We don't like inherited titles of nobility, inherited wealth, etc. Populism is a style of politics that appeals to the common man, common woman, average Joes, as opposed to the elite. And examples of populists today, Donald Trump would be an example. Bernie Sanders would also be an example. Two different types of populism on two different ends of the political spectrum, but both of them are, in their own way, populist in that their appeal is to average people. They position themselves as an average guy fighting the system. Key term, public policy. This is intentional actions of a government designed to achieve a goal. So a good example of a somewhat recent policy would be the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. The idea being increase access to health care by allowing more Americans to have health insurance. Under our system, the process through which policy is made is long, difficult, complicated, and usually ugly. It's like the joke, if you like sausage, don't visit a sausage factory, because the way you get the sausage is not pretty. This is true of many of our laws and policies that get passed as well. The reason for this is because there's so many different people, what a motivational speaker might call stakeholders, who have a role in this. You got citizens, businesses, industries, interest groups, labor unions, political parties, Congress, the courts, the federal departments and agencies, and the president. Not every single one of these groups has to support a new policy, but all of them are powerful, so you have to get most of them to do it. And each one has their own little pet projects or pet ideas they want incorporated into it. So at the end of the day, typically when you have a major policy overhaul, it ends up being thousands of pages long because you have to appease all these different groups. Policymaking process roughly follows this process. Problem is identified, it gets put on the agenda, a policy is formulated, it's enacted, it is implemented, and it's evaluated. So we'll use the healthcare thing. This is, I think, a useful one. So, problem. Healthcare in the United States is incredibly expensive, so much so that many people can't afford it. This gets identified by citizens who contact their elected officials and complain about this. Elected officials, seeing that this is a problem, put it on the agenda. Once put on the agenda, Congress then formulates a solution here, in this case, the Affordable Care Act, in which everybody, those with a stake in the policy, develop solutions to the problem. And those with a stake in the policy would be Congress itself, average citizens, consumer rights groups, the president, the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical industry. All these different groups have to come together and hammer out something they can agree on. Usually what they end up agreeing on, and this I think is true certainly of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, is something that not one person is completely thrilled about, but enough people can live with it that it ends up being policy. Once they do that, it's enacted, which means Congress passes it and the president signs it, or the president vetoes it and Congress overrides. Either way, it's enacted. Once enacted, the bureaucracy implements it, and then a few years down the road, we look and compare what the situation is today versus what it was before it went into effect, and that way we can evaluate how successful it's been. All right, some key terms here: responsiveness and equality. Responsiveness is the idea that the government should implement laws and policies that reflect the wishes of the public. This is not particularly rocket science. Equality, this is the idea that individuals are equal to their moral worth and should have equal treatment of the law and have equal access to the decision-making process. Again, this is more of an ideal than a fact. Do we have this today? No, of course not. If you call your member of Congress, are you going to get to talk to them? Probably not. If you donated $5 million to their PAC in the last election, are you going to get to talk to them? Well, you probably don't have to call them because they probably call you. So we don't have this. However, it's probably worth mentioning, definitely better today than we were 50 years ago when women and African Americans were completely shut out of the process. So we made some strides towards this, and we're probably never going to get to total equality, but we have made some progress. All right, does American democracy work? This is where in class we usually have some discussions. Is government responsive? Do we have equality? I'll let you make those calls for yourself. Think about it. We do have alternatives: autocracy, oligarchy, monarchy. Nobody really wants this, though. Autocracy is where power is concentrated in the hands of one ruler, like North Korea under Kim Jong-un. Monarchy is inherited kings and queens. Saudi Arabia is one of the last of these that still exist. An oligarchy is where power is concentrated in the hands of a powerful few, usually very wealthy individuals. Democracy, citizen engagement, we'll talk about this. In some ways, autocracy, oligarchy, and monarchies are easier because they don't really require anything at all of the citizens, other than you outwardly support the regime and come out and cheer when Kim Jong-un drives by in his motorcade. In a democracy, it's up to the citizens to be informed of the issues that are going on and vote accordingly. And, if you've been on Facebook, a lot of people aren't really up to speed on everything that's going on like they should be. Democracy, we'll talk about this. Trustee versus delegate theory. Trustee theory is that you elect officials to exercise their own judgment, whereas a delegate theory is you elect representatives to do what you want them to do. So in other words, if you're a member of Congress and there's a bill comes to the floor for a vote, and you believe that this bill is of vital importance to the future of the United States. You believe that it's good policy and that it is necessary to pass it for the good of the country. However, your constituents back home, they oppose it. If you're an advocate of the trustee theory, you would say that the representative should vote for it because they have studied it, and it would be a dereliction of duty to vote against a bill that they think is best for the country. A delegate theorist would say, no, you should vote against it because what really matters is what your constituents back home want. And if it damages the country, then that's what they wanted. You get what you want / deserve. Also, political equality, what does this mean? Quality of opportunity versus quality of outcome. Equality of opportunity, would be what you would get if everybody had equal chance for success in life at birth. If you get that, then equality of outcome should follow. So, Congress, I think about 20% of members of Congress are women today. If that represented the public, though, shouldn't that be more like 50%? So that's not an example of equality of outcome. Do we have equality of opportunity in the United States now? Well, no, we probably won't ever have it. If you're born in Hardin Valley, for example, to a doctor, your parents are both doctors, they're both married, you get to attend good schools, or you're born, won't name a town, let's just say an impoverished area, your parents are both meth addicts. You think these two people both have equal chances for success in life? Probably not. Now, are we doing better than we did in the past? Absolutely, for sure. All right. Why do people get involved in politics? Self-interest or civic interest? Self-interest, where you look out for yourself. You want the government to fix a pothole. You want less regulation of the industry you work in. You want lower taxes. Nothing wrong with self-interest. If you don't look out for yourself, no one's going to do it for you. Second is civic interest. You want what's good for the country as a whole or for your community as a whole. You may support more funding for education or for better schools, even if you don't have kids in schools, because that's good for society. All right, talk about some problems that we have right now. One is terrorism and civil liberties. I'm so old, I remember what the world was like before 9/11. Not going to say it was better necessarily, and it was. And I mean, in terms of most metrics, wealth and overall crime rate and life expectancy, things are actually better today than they were before 9/11. But they don't feel like it. The world suddenly became a whole lot scarier. You got to remember, Soviet Union collapses in 91, Cold War ends. Looks like we're entering a period of growth and prosperity and peace. And then 9/11 happens and reality sets in. Been fighting terrorism now for close to 20 years. Of course, this is necessary. We have to do this, but we run into problems of liberty versus order. There's a delicate balance between protecting us from terrorists and also protecting our civil liberties. You've flown an airplane lately? If you do, you probably know it's not a fun experience, at least getting on a plane. You have to go through security. You might get patted down. You can't take an open drink onto a plane. We are definitely much more afraid today than we were 20 years ago. Also, more freedom would be, why not take an open drink on a plane? Why do you have to get patted down? I mean, these are violations of your individual rights, aren't they? Yeah, individual liberty at least. Sure, but it makes us safer. So order is winning out right now in this area. Things like the Patriot Act would be an example of this too. May make us safer, may take away some of our liberty. Should we do it? Well, that's for you to decide. Polarization in the media. Here's a fun experiment for you. Go home today, or maybe you already are home. Turn on Fox News. Watch it for an hour. Flip over to MSNBC. Watch it for an hour. Think the media are polarized? Well, you can't really do that and not realize that they are. It's almost like they're talking about two different countries, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. or it seems to at least. Maybe it's not, maybe it's an illusion, but it definitely seems like it. We can't even agree on basic facts anymore. And this is a problem because this is how societies fracture. And could this someday lead to a civil war or a breakdown of the society? Possible it could. I mean, I don't want to sound like a doomsday prophet here, but you have two sides essentially that hate each other so much. They've hated each other so much. The logical next step is violence, isn't it? When we've seen a little bit of that, not much yet. Hopefully we'll step back from this before it gets really ugly. But that's something I think we need to be concerned about. Another problem: entitlement, Social Security. I know people don't like it when you say Social Security is an entitlement. I don't understand why, because their argument is always, I work for this, it's mine, but it's not an entitlement. Well, if you earn something and you work for it, that does make it, that's like the textbook definition of entitlement, but whatever. Nation's getting older, life expectancy is getting longer. This is great. I love this. I hope life expectancy reaches 100 years or longer. But there are costs to this. The cost is that the federal government spends a whole lot more money on old people than they do on young people. And why? Because old people get Social Security and Medicare, and these programs are expensive. And when Social Security was first launched, the average person didn't live long enough to draw Social Security. Now the average life expectancy is close to 80 years, which means the average person can expect to draw Social Security for 15 years, maybe as long as 30 years or longer. The population's graying. This is funded by taxes which are taken out of workers' paychecks. So once upon a time, the ratio of workers to retirees was 16-1. Now it's 4-1, and at some point it's going to get closer to 2-1. This is true of Medicare as well. Eventually, we're going to run out of money to pay for this. So what are we going to have to do? Well, we're going to either have to raise taxes, raise the retirement age, or cut benefits, or some combination of the three. Nobody wants to do this, though, because nobody wants to pay, nobody, myself included, wants to pay more taxes. Nobody, myself included, wants to wait till they're older to retire. And nobody, myself included, want to receive fewer benefits after having paid for more benefits for people retired now. So, yes, this is going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem around 2030. Why don't we work on it? Because the election is in 2020. That's the short answer. Our system doesn't really reward short, long-term planning. If someone were to come up with a system, a plan to fix these problems, it would probably not advantage them politically. All right, look at the budget. We have a massive debt at this time in our history. Here's where the money goes. As you can see, 1/5 of it goes to Social Security. About that much, a little less, goes to Department of Defense, mandatory spending, unemployment benefits, things like that. It's about 15%. Medicare is about 13%. Medicaid and state children's health insurance programs about 8%. And that's almost 3/4 of the budget. Everybody agrees, if you take a poll and ask, everyone will agree that the budget needs to be cut. When you ask them what specifically should be cut, the only thing a majority of Americans say would be foreign aid. Problem is, foreign aid accounts for less than 1% of the federal budget. Not saying it should or shouldn't be cut, but I am saying if that's all you've got, it's not going to get you very far. If you really want to get this under control, you're going to have to cut into some of this stuff. But once you do that, people are not going to like it. Somebody's ox is going to get gored, as they say. And I don't know what the answer is. The answer I can tell you this is either going to be we cut benefits, we raise taxes, or some combination of the two. And whatever it is, there are going to be people unhappy. Our best solution would be to work on it now before we reach crisis stage, but I don't really have much confidence we're going to do that. All right, immigration and diversity. America's changing. Does this matter? Shouldn't. Does it? I don't know. This is one of the issues, I think, which is polarizing us. So something here to think about. Education. How are we doing in terms of education? The answer is the rest of the world is doing better than us. Cost of college is rising. Although you're smart, you're taking advantage of tuition-free college for 2 years, so you're avoiding the debt trap, and I would strongly encourage you to do that as long as you possibly can. But education is important not only because it prepares you for jobs, but also because we're a democracy. An informed public is what you need to govern. Not saying everybody has to go to college, but everybody does need to have an understanding of the wider world, of how economics works, science, how the government works, some knowledge of history, if you're going to effectively govern. And so this is one of the reasons that education is important, in addition to just preparing you for a job. Here's some scores here. This might be a little dated, but you get the point. We're struggling. Now, a couple things. One is I want to say that things definitely could be better, but things are not as horrible as you might think or as these things might suggest. One of the things we have in the United States, going back to our idea of egalitarianism, is that everybody can grow up to be president. Most of the rest of the world doesn't really believe that. Not everybody can grow up to be Steve Jobs. We like to think that, but, I mean, really, most people can't do that. So what most other education systems in other countries do is they figure out early on what someone has an aptitude at. Oh, you're good at math. You're good with numbers. You might want to become a computer programmer or engineer, something like that. Oh, you're good at writing. You might want to become a journalist or a proofreader or something like that. Oh, you're not good at anything. Well, you might want to dig ditches. No offense to ditch diggers, but that's usually what people say. Here we don't really put kittens, so you get routed towards one of these careers early in your career, maybe as soon as 4th grade. Here, everybody graduates high school and gets to decide what they want to do from there. And they can also change their mind at any point as well. My wife is from Germany. She said she wanted to be a doctor, but she says she's too old to go back to school and do it. She said this when she was 32 years old. Yeah, that's a very much a German worldview, very much not an American worldview. And we believe you can reinvent yourself at any time. So the point I'm making at this is that these countries that are scoring so much better than us, we're basically comparing all of our students versus their top tier students. So, of course, we're going to be a little lower. Now, this is not a total defense of our system, because our system is flawed, I think, and does need quite a bit of reform. But I'm saying the situation is not as dire as it seems. It is only bad, not terrible, I guess. It's maybe what I'm saying. I don't know if bad, but it could be better. I'll say that. Now that I have put such a downer on you, I want to emphasize a few things. We do have problems, but you know what? We are doing unbelievably well in terms of how most humans have lived. 99% of all humans who have ever lived in the history of planet Earth would consider the times we're living in today to be a utopia. Life expectancies are longer than ever before. We have better health care than ever before. We have more wealth than ever before. We have more food. We don't worry about famines anymore. We are the most free people who have ever lived in the history of planet Earth. And this is especially true if you're a woman or a minority. Now, does this mean everything's great? No. Does this mean that we don't have a lot of work to do? Absolutely not. We still have a lot of problems that we need to work on. But on the balance, we're doing pretty good. But the important thing is to always strive to do better. And I'm going to go ahead and close it there for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you have any questions about the course, about what we've talked about, reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you any way I can. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for the Constitution. Have a good day.